Our thought for today is, sorry, I'm practicing social distancing became the most popular breakup text of 2020. Today we have Wednesday of Holy Week. The last 2 days we've been hearing St. John's account of the Last Supper. Today we hear St. Matthew's account of the Last Supper. And we see it begins with Judas Iscariot going to the chief priest saying, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" Bishop Sheen in his book, The Life of Christ, says, it is never a good attitude for us to have of, what are you willing to give me? It's a very selfish attitude. We don't know all the motives for the reason why Judas would betray his master. He had spent 3 years with him. Perhaps it was for the money. Perhaps it was his greed and avarice. Perhaps he was disillusioned, or perhaps he wanted Jesus to be able to get in front of the high court to show who he truly was. We don't know his motives. But we do know that it said the chief priests and Pharisees did not want to arrest Jesus during the Passover, because the historians, Josephus, tell us there was 1 to 2 million pilgrims in Jerusalem at that time. And there would be huge crowds around, and there's no way that the crowd would allow Jesus to be arrested. And they just welcomed him on Palm Sunday, and there was great excitement about the Lord. So there was no way that they felt they could arrest him during the Passover with those huge crowds. So they were going to wait till after that. But now the things changed, because one of his own disciples came to them and said, I am willing to show you where he's going to be. I will let you know where you can arrest him, where there would not be large crowds. And so they paid him 30 pieces of silver. St. Matthew, who was the tax collector, former tax collector, who had worked for the IRS, he's the only one who mentions the price of how much Jesus was sold for. And it was 30 pieces of silver. Probably in modern currency, the scholars say between $800 and $3,000. And it was the price of a slave. And we know that Joseph, the patriarch Joseph of the Old Testament, was also sold by his brothers into slavery. Now back then, 1,500 years before, it was 20 pieces of silver. But of course, with inflation, things went up over 1,500 years. And now the price of a slave was 30 pieces of silver. And we see Jesus here as the new Joseph, the new patriarch Joseph. We know Jesus is the new Adam, the new Solomon, the new David, the new Moses, but he's also the new Joseph. Both were the beloved sons of their father. Both had very special garments. Joseph, his dream coat, Jesus, his seamless garment. Both were betrayed by a man named Judah. Joseph's brother Judah is the one who sold him to the Ishmaelites, and Jesus' disciple Judas, the same name, sold Jesus. Both eventually were turned over to the Gentiles, Joseph to the Ishmaelites and Jesus to the Romans. Both during their life had to go into Egypt. Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. Jesus had to escape to Egypt to escape King Herod. Joseph was thrown into the cistern for 3 days and then was brought out. Jesus died and was placed in a tomb for 3 days and then came forth from the dead. And then both were placed at the right hand. Joseph, the right hand of Pharaoh, Jesus, the right hand of his father, and both were responsible for feeding the whole world with bread. Joseph told Pharaoh to save up for 7 years, and then the whole world came to Pharaoh and Joseph to be fed with bread, and Jesus would feed the whole world with himself, the bread of life. So we see Jesus as the new Joseph. And then we have the Last Supper, where Jesus says to two of his apostles, Peter and John, go into the city of Jerusalem to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time draws near. In your house I will celebrate the Passover with my disciples. See, Jesus had no problem inviting himself over for dinner. He just says, I'm coming over. And whose house was it? Perhaps it was Joseph of Arimathea's house. Others speculate it was the parents of St. Mark, the evangelist, John Mark, the gospel writer. We don't know for sure, but it was certainly the upper room, and Jesus celebrated his Passover there. And notice he uses code language. He says, go into the city to a certain man. He did this. He did not want Judas to know where the Last Supper would be. Jesus knew Judas had gone into the chief priest, was going to hand him over. Jesus did not want the Last Supper to be interrupted. He didn't want the temple guard crashing into the Last Supper while he was giving us his body and blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. He wanted that special time alone with his disciples, so even Judas did not know where the Last Supper would be held. But once he found out where it was, he knew that after the Last Supper, Jesus would go and pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's when he went to tell the chief priests and get the temple guards to have Jesus arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then the gospel concludes with Jesus saying, one of you will betray me. Each of the disciples says, surely it is not I, Lord. As Bishop Sheen says, in the presence of divinity, no one can be assured of his own innocence. And each one goes around and says, surely it is not I, Lord. But only one man says, surely it is not I, Rabbi. And that was Judas. And that really fulfills what St. Paul said. No one can call Jesus Lord except by the Holy Spirit. Of course, you could say the words, but it's referring to having Jesus Lord of your life. No one can claim Jesus as Lord of your life except by the power of the Holy Spirit. And we see Satan had already entered Judas. He had driven out the Holy Spirit. And now Judas cannot call Jesus Lord. He calls him Rabbi, and he hands him over to death.